Bars Can't Hold Us by Laura of Matoria. Chapter 2. Lance and Keith were silent for a while, listening to Hunk breathe, making sure he was fully asleep. There was a rasping noise deep in his throat that Lance didn't like he'd been yelling too loud and too long. He tried to angle himself in such a way that it might ease Hunk's breathing. If he shifted too far, though, Hunk's hand tightened where it had curled in a fist, clutching the bottom of Lance's tunic-like shirt. So he gave up trying to move and just sat there, holding his buddy. When he thought it was safe, Keith made a frustrated noise and scrubbed his hands over his face. He doesn't remember a thing, so we still don't know what they want from us. I think we'll find out for ourselves soon enough, Lance said grimly. And anyway, there's really only one reason why they would go after Hunk first. Keith tilted his head, eyes narrowing. He didn't say anything, but Lance understood the question. He rolled his eyes, just a little. It wasn't really Keith's fault. It had taken Lance a while to figure out, too. Think about the three of us, our skills and specialties. We're all pilots, but you're a swordsman and close combat specialist, and I'm a sniper/master of tactics. Well, Hunk? He's a mechanic. A very smart, very talented engineer. They know it, too, with all the intelligent questions he asked while we were touring the hangars. Understanding began to dawn in Keith's eyes. They wanted his technological expertise. 2 guesses as to what they're interested in. The Lions. That's the one. It made sense in retrospect. Every Malgordan they'd met had been absolutely fascinated by the Voltron Lions and the way they formed into a larger whole, asking question after question. They had been disappointed that the Paladins hadn't taken a lion down to greet them. The pod ship they chose to bring wasn't even a quarter as sexy. Looking back, Lance remembered the almost hungry gleam in the Supreme Commander's eye when he talked about the lions, and the way his face twisted when Chiro politely put him off, unwilling to give a time when he might see one in person. Keith frowned. Do you think he told him anything? No, Lance's answer was instant, unthinking. Then he went still, considering it more carefully. No, I don't think so. Hunk is strong, especially when he doesn't think he will be. Unconsciously, his arms tightened around Hunk's sleeping form. He must have been so scared and overwhelmed, though. I'm kind of glad he doesn't remember. Yeah. Keith nodded and bent over, resting his chin on his folded hands as he stared off into a corner. What could he even tell them anyway? Do any of us actually understand how the lines work? I don't know. I doubt even Coran knows for sure, and he's up in the castle out of reach. Of course, of the 5 paladins, Hunk definitely knew the most. Pidge loved modifications and coding, but she didn't do as much with the mechanical side. Lance wasn't going to say that out loud, though. The Malgordans were no doubt listening to every word they said, and he didn't want to give them more reason to concentrate on Hunk. Would do anything to avoid that, more like. Besides, Lance said instead, this has to be the most inefficient way ever to get information about a highly complex machine. Interrogate an engineer until he starts telling you stuff? Who even knows how coherent he'd be, or if he'd be able to put it in a logical order? Or even how much he'd remember after going through trauma, like the amount of hurt they would have to put on Hunk to make him talk. You'd be better off trying to hack the blueprints from the people you were trying to steal the thing from in the first place. There, he thought with a bitter twist of his lips. Are you listening, you sons of Quiznak? Leave Hunk alone. You're violating your own principles by even pretending that this is the best way to get what you want. And no way would they ever be able to hack anything from a system that Pidge was protecting. Lance was sure of that. Keith grunted. He was leaning over and tapping the floor with a fingernail, a distracted and restless motion that showed how badly he wanted to escape. Enough to use his fingernails to do it. Yeah, that's a good point. Lance hadn't exactly been aiming his speech at Keith, but he smiled at the sincerity in the guy's voice. He should probably tell Keith that they were being monitored and not everything he said necessarily had to have a response. But this was kind of hilarious, so maybe he wouldn't. But he went cold at Keith's next words. Maybe they're not after information about the mechanics then. Lance's mind went blank. What? What else could they want? Keith shrugged, still staring down at the floor as he picked away at it with his nail. Dunno. The lions are kind of half magical, half spiritual, aren't they? Well, and half mechanical. A quarter magic? Whatever. Maybe they want information on that part. Stuff you'd never find in a blueprint. Lance's breath stuttered for a moment, but he brought it under control. His nose scrunched up in irritation at being thrown off balance by anything Keith said, even momentarily. Well, it's still not like Hunk or any of us are going to be able to tell them how that works. Even Karan doesn't really get that stuff, and Allura is the most magical of us all, and she can't explain it either. So there's no point in asking any of us any questions at all. Keith hummed thoughtfully. Lance hoped the Malcordans were listening. Leave them alone. Leave all of them alone. Just put their memories or whatever and give them back to their team. Ugh. Keith finally tired of one useless activity and decided to do another one. He stopped scratching his fingernail against the dark concrete and kicked to his feet, then started pacing the cell the way he had when they were first dropped in here. He went from corner to corner to corner, skipping the wall where Hunk and Lance sat, giving occasional glances to the completely useless cot they'd been given. It had no mattress, not even a solid surface, just an empty metal frame taking up one corner of the cell. Lance couldn't fathom why it was even in here, just to taunt them with what they didn't have. Lance watched Keith pace, willing himself to find it soothing, like watching fish swim in an aquarium. Keith didn't move like a fish, though. He moved like a rat in a cage, or like a Tasmanian devil Lance had seen at a zoo once. The Tasmanian devil constantly paced over certain paths in its enclosure over and over and over every single day. So many times that the paths were worn to hard-packed dirt from what had originally been healthy growing green grass. This was the same. This was a creature of instinct and strength, a predator with sharp teeth, shut up against its will in a space far too small for it. The sight was about as far from soothing as was possible to get. Lance felt his eyelid twitch, a headache building behind the eye. He put up with it for as long as he could, unwilling to take away anything that Keith found even marginally soothing in this horrible situation. Eventually, Keith would get bored and sit down again, right? He had to. But he didn't. Would you please stop? Lance finally snapped, skipping over all the polite requests like he'd already made them and going straight to high-pitched irritation. Repressing his urge to say something never went well for Lance. You're driving me apples and bananas! Hunk whimpered at the noise and curled up into him even tighter, and Lance's heart banged with guilt. Sorry, he murmured, voice contrite and soothing. He curled over Hunk a little tighter and pressed a kiss on the top of his head. Sorry. Stay asleep, buddy. It's okay. Hunk relaxed against him, uncurling slightly from the ball he'd turned into. His weight was limp and heavy on Lance's chest, in his arms, but alive and breathing and shivering in the cold, and that was the best Lance could hope for at the moment. Sorry, he whispered again, and Hunk's hand tightened in his shirt as if in answer. Keith had whirled at Lance's outburst, eyes fiery, ready to take him on with good old verbal fisticuffs. But at this, his face softened and his shoulders slumped. He wandered back over to them and sat cross-legged on the floor again, facing Lance and Hunk. He was folded half over himself with his arms in his lap, the picture of woe. I know I wasn't accomplishing anything, he muttered, half an explanation and half a complaint at Lance for interrupting. But it felt better to be moving, you know? Lance nodded. He did know. If his arms weren't full of a sleeping, hurting Hunk, he would be inclined to pace uselessly too. Sorry, he muttered in return. I'm just on edge. I get it. Keith looked away, then back to Lance. Could I ask something? Sure. Lance blew out a breath and tried to relax. Talking has to be better than watching you pace like an animal. Keith squinted at him as if he wasn't sure if that was an insult and whether he should rise to the bait, but after a moment he let it slide. He leaned back where he sat and spread a hand, encompassing both Lance and Hunk. Did something change between you two recently? Like last night? Lance's forehead wrinkled. He had no idea where this was going. No? Hunk and I have had a great relationship for a pretty long time. I know that much. Keith's forehead wrinkled in confusion.
you've always been close, but I guess really close now in the past few months. But today was the first time I heard you call each other that. I wasn't expecting it.
What? Lance's wrinkles got deeper. This wasn't helping him understand the question at all. What did we call each other? And why would you think something changed last night? Keith flapped a hand in frustration.
You know, that.
No, Keith, Lance said as patiently as he could. I don't know. You're going to have to spell it out for me. Keith opened his mouth, then closed it. Astonishingly, his cheeks pinkened. Then he leaned forward, never breaking eye contact with Lance, and let the word out in an embarrassed whisper.
Babe. You called each other babe.
Lance almost burst out laughing. He stopped himself just in time, not wanting to disturb Hunk. Giggles still broke through, shaking his throat and making everything seem a little lighter. That's what is your panties in a bunch? Keith leaned back, frowning.
Don't wear panties, Lance. Don't make fun of me.
Right. Sorry. I didn't mean to insult you. Lance settled down. He shook his head, still grinning widely. We've been calling each other that for a long time, man. Just not very often. And I guess not in public, though it's not like we did that on purpose. Special occasions? Like, we call each other a lot of pet names all the time. I'm sure you've noticed. But that one is saved for, I don't know, serious moments. Keith nodded slowly, his face creased in thought.
So I witnessed something private then?
Kind of. Not that we care. You don't have to apologize or anything. What does that have to do with our relationship changing? Keith tilted his head to the side.
Just, you were flirting yesterday with that Melcordan lieutenant.
Lance shuddered a bit at the memory. He truly, deeply regretted that now. It still didn't answer the question. Yeah, I flirt with a lot of people.
Yeah, well, doesn't it bother Hunk?
No? I mean, not more than it bothers the rest of you. You've seen him sighing and rolling his eyes too. Keith shifted uncomfortably.
Okay, yeah, but I mean, aren't you a couple?
Oh. Suddenly this made sense. Lance smiled and relaxed against the wall, pulling Hunk in closer against him. Oh, okay, I get it now. Keith raised his eyebrows. No, we're not a couple. At least not the way you're meaning.
So you weren't involved?
Lance rolled his eyes. Trust Keith to be blunt 95% of the time and try his hand at subtlety the one time it didn't matter. No, Keith. Hunk and I are not doing the do. Keith somehow looked even more confused. But we hug all the time? We called each other pet names? We cuddle on the couches? We spend time with each other and make personalized presents for no reason at all? Yes, we do all of that. It's really good. Really special. Hunk is incredibly important to me, and I'm incredibly important to him. But we're not having sex. Keith squinted at him.
You do know that you're both quite attractive, right?
Lance snorted. Softly, though. It's not about aesthetics, man. I think Hunk is as cute and cuddly as a teddy bear, and he likes my face, too. He said so. But that's just not what we are to each other.
Is there a word for what you are to each other?
Lance was brought up short, frowning. He'd never actually thought about it. What he and Hunk had was good, really good, and they were both glad that their relationship had deepened this much since they ended up stuck in space together fighting aliens. But they had never made any attempt to define what they were, just letting it flow, letting things fall where they would. They were both comfortable and laid back like that, and they both liked that about each other. I don't know. Really good friends? Keith wrinkled his nose at him.
This is more than really good friends. More than best friends. If even I can see that, you have to know it too.
Really good friends? I don't know, man. I never thought it needed a label. Keith huffed, obviously dissatisfied. Lance didn't know how to fix that for him. He shrugged. I don't know what else to say, dude. Hunk and me are really good friends, and yeah, I guess our friendship is a little deeper than normal. But it's still friendship. The only thing I can really say to explain it is that it's definitely not sexual and it's definitely not romantic. I don't know. Does that help?
Keith hesitated, then nodded slowly. I guess. A little bit.
Lance sighed and slumped against the wall. Sorry, I didn't expect your question to be so hard to answer.
Neither did I.
Keith chewed his lip in thought, staring at his lap, then looked up.
So Hunk really doesn't mind when you flirt, huh?
Meaning he doesn't get jealous? No, he knows I still have a romantic side that needs to be fed. And if he ever got a crush on someone, or if he finally freaking did anything about the crushes he already has, I wouldn't be upset either. I'd be happy. I would cheer him on.
Do you think your relationship would change if one of you started one with someone else?
Maybe? I don't know. It hasn't come up. We'll figure it out when that happens, if ever. But I know that I'll always be really important to Hunk, and he'll always be really important to me, no matter what else changes. Always. Something passed over Keith's face at that last part. Not strong enough to be jealousy. More like longing. Lance's heart went up mushy. Dang it. Why did it keep doing that? Hey, man, he said, soft now. Can't help noticing you're starting to get goosebumps here. Keith blinked and looked down at his own arms. Oh. He lifted his hands and rubbed them over his upper arms. Lance hadn't thought that giving up his jacket would be that much of a sacrifice for Keith, but apparently it was. Hunk has been shivering too. Would you come sit with us? Just cuddle up on the other side. It would be a big help.
Okay.
Keith didn't fight it. He moved, then settled down next to Hunk, without a murmur. They settled in for a wait. What they were waiting for, Lance wasn't sure. For Hunk to wake up, for the Malcordons to come back for them again, for something to happen. Lance was tired, deep and aching with it, but he felt too wired to sleep. His back tense, arms still clenched around Hunk's limp weight. Bad enough getting kidnapped in the first place, but did they have to go and do it in the middle of the freaking night? He had been fast asleep when they came for him. No warning, no chance to fight back, to call an alarm. One moment he was deep in slumberland, dreaming about beautiful babes on a tropical beach with blazing white sand and blue skies and the hum of the ocean. And then he was awake and something was pressed over his mouth and nose cutting off his breath. He panicked and flailed, tried to scream, but no sound made it out past the strong hand that was clamped over his face. Other hands held his arms, his legs, bearing down and pinning him to the bed. He ran out of oxygen almost immediately and slumped back, dizzy and panicked, lungs aching. He was paralyzed with terror. He couldn't see anything in this still, dark room. Then he felt something small and round and cold press against his temple, and someone's breath gusted over his face. This is a gun. A Malcordon voice, one he didn't recognize. The Malcordon pressed the gun harder against his temple, and Lance flinched as much as he could with all the weight holding him down. If I lift my hand and let you breathe, you will not scream. If you scream, I will shoot you. It will not kill you, but it will hurt very much. The pain will make you lose consciousness. Now would you like to breathe? I will lift my hand. Do not scream. Lance blinked rapidly and tried to nod, but he couldn't move his head even that much. The Malcordon made a noise of amusement, and the hand lifted. Lance immediately sucked in a huge, wheezing breath, still panicking at the lack of air. His body convulsed, and he badly wanted to cough, but he was afraid that any sharp movement would be interpreted as an attempt to scream, so he choked it back. There were tears in his eyes, though whether from pain or fear he didn't know. Possibly both. Probably both. You will make no sound, the Malcordon said. Lance nodded. They were already pulling him up, dragging him completely without effort on his part. It was terrifying to be manhandled so easily by so many people at once. Lance had absolutely no control over this, over his own body, over anything at all. He couldn't see, and he could barely breathe. His lungs were aching, and a gun was being held to his head. He had no choice but to let them do what they wanted to him. They gagged him, just to make even more sure that he wouldn't make a sound, then put something fabric over his head, like a bag or pouch. He could breathe through his nose, but his mouth was obstructed, and the fabric between his face and the open air made breathing feel even more difficult than it already was. Then the hands pulled him to his feet. He felt cuffs being snapped around his wrists, and his arms were pulled behind him and bound behind his back. Escape was truly impossible now. They made him walk, blind and almost deaf, and still struggling to breathe. He stumbled on bare feet, struggling to keep up with the hands that pulled his elbows and shoved at his back. Eventually, he was knocked off his feet, and he thudded down on a hard surface. It began to move, and he knew he was in a vehicle. After his initial panic died down enough to allow some space to think, Lance's primary emotion was shame. He should have been able to fight back, somehow. He had been completely unable to do anything at all. Shiro would have fought back if some strangers had tried to grab him in his sleep. Keith would have fought back too, hair-trigger reflexes serving him even in such an extreme and unexpected situation. He would have killed some of them, if not all. Even Hunk, who was the least aggressive of the 5 paladins, could break out enormous reserves of power and strength when pressed. He would have done something, anything. But Lance had done nothing. He let them do what they wanted with him. It made Lance's cheeks burn to think about it, and he would never ever say it aloud, but he had been relieved when the Malcordans finally removed the bag over his head and unsnapped the restraints around his arms, then shoved him into this cell. Because here with him were Keith and Hunk too, looking just as disoriented and terrified as Lance was. Lance didn't want them to be here, didn't want any of them to be kidnapped and held prisoner by these cruel people, but at the same time, a huge wave of relief washed over him. Not just because he wasn't alone, though Lance was incredibly, immensely grateful for that. No, he was relieved because they hadn't been able to fight off their attackers either. Lance wasn't completely incompetent and useless if the kidnappers had managed to get the drop on Hunk and Keith too. He wasn't a failure for letting himself get caught and manipulated and forced, because Hunk and Keith were here with him, and they were both the farthest thing possible from failures. It was shameful, and Lance felt bad for feeling this way, but he couldn't help it. If he could do anything, have any wish in the universe right at this moment, he would want Hunk back with Shiro and Pidge, or safe in the Castle of Lions. Or home on Earth, honestly, just anywhere but here, beaten and bloody and sleeping restlessly in Lance's arms. But Lance's first emotion on seeing him in this cell had not been horror or grief or anger that Hunk was being subjected to the same treatment that Lance was enduring. No, it had been relief. And Lance would never be able to forgive himself for that. The relief hadn't lasted long, of course. When the Malcordans came in the cell and took Hunk away, it died completely. Lance and Keith had both thrown themselves at the door in a frenzy of desperation and rage, but Lance had definitely been more reckless about it. Which was weird, him being the reckless one instead of Keith. He had been close to dislocating his shoulder when the Malcordans activated the cuffs and dropped him to the floor. His shoulder still ached now. He might have popped something, but he deserved it. At last, something happened. There was a tingle in Lance's wrist, a buzz of sound that was almost too high to be audible, and that was all the warning he got before the cuffs activated. One hand was dragged forcibly from Hunk's hair to thud against the wall, and the other hit the floor between his legs, torn from Hunk's fingers. On the other side of Hunk's body, he heard Keith grunt as his cuffs hit the floor too. Hunk whined in his sleep and slumped even more bonelessly against Lance's chest, sagging without Lance's arms to support him. Lance had a bare moment to be grateful that they hadn't activated Hunk's cuffs too, and woken him from much-needed sleep, but he was overwhelmed with blinding rage. They had taken away the use of his hands. He couldn't hold Hunk like this! How dare they! The latch of the door released with a loud clunk, and Lance's eyes whipped over to stare at it. He could feel Keith's attention focusing there too. Razor sharp. The door opened, and a Malcordan came in. Lance's throat tightened until he could barely breathe, though he wasn't sure if it was fear, rage, shame, or some combination of the three. He recognized this Malcordan. Yes, he certainly did. This was the lieutenant he had been flirting with yesterday before this ordeal began, before he knew what they were capable of, what they were going to do to him and Hunk and Keith. Corrales! Lance hissed through his teeth. He refused to use her title. Yesterday, he had been as polite as could be, all Lieutenant this and Lieutenant that, but respect was dead now. She had been friendly in return, and he'd even thought that she might be flirting back with one or two replies. Her eyes had been bright, her smile sharp. Now, looking back, that image seemed predatory in his mind instead of pretty. She had been playing him for a fool all along, and Lance was getting sick of it. Why did the women of this universe hate him so much? She smiled now, sharp and wide and bright, and yeah, definitely a predator's smile. Lance shuddered, his body tensing, though he tried to hold himself still for Hunk's sake. He hoped Hunk would stay asleep through this, whatever it was. Whatever she came to do, to say, to taunt them, to question them, whatever. Just let them leave Hunk alone. He'd been through enough. Greetings, Blue Paladin. Corrales stepped to the middle of the cell and stood there with her hands on her hips, grinning down at him from a height. Lance was forced to look up at her to meet her eyes, but he would not be intimidated. He was seething, teeth clenched and lips tight, and he hoped she could see the fire in his eyes. Corrales chuckled, shoulders bouncing, and gestured around the cell with an arrogant little flick of the wrist. I do appreciate you accepting my invitation to come and visit me in my humble abode, though I suppose you weren't given much of a choice, were you? Still, you should be pleased. You said you would like to get to know me, even offered to come to my place. Are you not happy to be here? Lance shuddered and bit his lip for a moment before replying. He didn't want to burst into a shout and wake Hunk. He had to control himself. You're a smart woman, Corrales. I think you already know the answer to that question. She shook her head, broad and mocking. Tisk, such rudeness from my honored guest. I thought you would at least be a gentleman, but you turned out to be a bore. I'm disappointed. What do you want with us? Keith spat, his voice harsh and grating. What did you do to Hunk? The Yellow Paladin? She looked over at the form slumped against Lance with a dismissive eye and shrugged. Whatever we wanted. Despite his determination to be still, Lance jerked against the cuffs with a sudden urgent need to leap to his feet and punch that woman in the face. There was sharp, hasty movement on Keith's side too, his body lurching forward, then pulled back by the cuffs. His breath whistled out through his teeth. You'll never get what you want. Keith gritted out. Whatever it is, doesn't matter. You'll never get it. We'll never give you anything. Corrales raised her eyebrows and turned her attention to him, her smile becoming somehow even more smug, more infuriating. We'll see. I don't think you quite understand your position yet, Red Paladin. We do not require you to give anything to us at all. What we want, we will simply take, and you will be unable to stop us. And what is it that you want? Lance demanded, still struggling against the cuffs. Information about the lines? You want to know how they work? Is that why you interrogated Hunk first? He forced himself to settle back, curving his body over Hunk as much as he could. A tight smile stretched across his face. I know he didn't tell you anything. He didn't say a word. You were embarrassed by your failure. That's why you wiped his memory, wasn't it? Because you couldn't stand knowing that you had lost, so you didn't want him to know either. Corrales' left eye twitched, which might have been a sign that Lance had struck a nerve. He logged that info away for later. But her smile never wavered. You certainly do make a lot of assumptions for a self-proclaimed master of tactics, Blue Paladin. You understand nothing of your purpose here. But it has to do with the lions, doesn't it? Based on her body language and expression, Lance was almost completely certain of that now. You guys think you can build creatures of magic and metal from scratch, just from the incoherent ramblings of a few beaten prisoners? Wow! The military of Malcord is a lot dumber than I thought it was. Why us? Keith added, though that question had been pretty far from Lance's mind. It seemed irrelevant to him. I get Hunk. He's a skilled engineer and knows the most about the lions of anyone you can get your hands on.
But why me? Why Lance? If you need someone besides Hunk to get information on the lines, just keep me. I'm the best pilot of the three of us. Lance doesn't even hold a candle to my skill. Wipe his memory and let him go.
Oh, I don't think so. We have a use for all three of you. Corrales stepped over to Keith and crouched down in front of him, then reached out to trail one finger over his jawline. Keith bore it for as long as he could, his teeth clenched and eyes fiery, then turned his head sharply away. Corrales grinned. She looked at him, then to Lance. Truthfully, we would have been pleased to capture all 5 paladins of Voltron, but the Black Paladin is too dangerous with that weaponized limb of his, and the Green Paladin is too young. We are not war criminals. We will not imprison a child. The sheer hypocrisy of this threatened to take Lance's breath away. He stared at Corrales for a moment, unblinking. For real? Corrales narrowed her eyes at him. Are you questioning the morality of the Malcordan military? Lance almost burst into hysterical laughter. He held himself off, mostly for Hunk's sake. It was a straight-up miracle that the poor guy hadn't woken up already with all this going on. He decided to try a different approach. What if I told you that me and Hunk and Keith are all under the age of majority on our home planet? Would you let us go? Something flickered deep in Corrales' eyes. She looked at him, then back to Keith. She studied him closely for a long moment, tilting her head to the side. Keith stared back at her, eyes fierce and unwavering. Corrales looked to Lance with a sneer. You lie. The 3 of you are adults. Lance's mouth twisted. Well, yeah, but only because we've been in space for a while now. When we started this stupid field trip, Hunk and me weren't old enough to vote, and Keith was only slightly older. We're still not old enough to buy certain intoxicating substances back home. Corrales frowned. What does that matter? Nothing, apparently. Not to you anyway, because even if we were minors, you wouldn't let us go, would you? Disgust crept into Lance's voice. He made no attempt to hide it. Don't pretend to sit atop some throne of morality full of noble intentions and goals. Not to us. We know just how despicable you are, just how low you're willing to stoop. Between one blink and the next, Corrales was no longer crouching in front of Keith. She was in front of Lance instead, her face terrible with rage. Lance heard a sharp crack in the air, and pain bloomed along the left side of his face as his head snapped away. She had backhanded him so fast and hard that he hadn't even seen her hand move. For a second, his vision went black and white, and he saw stars. Hunk, still sagging against him, sagged even further, then suddenly went still. Lance sat frozen, panting, fighting down the urge to yell or cry. He blinked at the tears, forcing them back. He would not cry in front of this woman. He would not even in shock or pain. He wouldn't. He felt the tension in Hunk as he gradually came to his senses and registered the situation, and he willed him to be still, to keep lying there slumped against Lance in the wall. Don't move. Don't let her know you're awake. Please, buddy, stay out of this. If at any point he and Hunk were going to develop telepathic powers because of the constant connection to the lines, or whatever, this would be a great time for it. Lance thought at him as hard as he could. Be still. Be still. Be still. No idea if it worked or not, but Hunk was still. Anyway, maybe he was trying to figure out what was going on after being abruptly woken, or maybe he had already figured it out and was smart enough to see that playing dead was the best play. Be still. Please, don't let her know you're awake. He heard Keith cursing up a storm, struggling uselessly against his cuffs again. Don't bother thinking at him. Keith wouldn't pay attention even if he could hear him. Just try that. Just try that again with my hands free. You just try it. Let me go and see what I'll do. It made no sense. Nothing but a lot of angry words and tangled up threats pouring out of Keith's mouth, but a part of Lance welcomed the distraction. Corrales made no response, focused entirely on Lance. After a long moment to process, to compartmentalize and push the fear and pain and helplessness into little maxes in his brain where he could control them, Lance slowly turned his head back to look Corrales in the face again. He smirked slowly, deliberately, the corner of his mouth curling up. She had split the skin over his cheekbone. He felt the blood trickling down, slowly reaching for his chin.
child abuser," he said. She backhanded him again on the other side, just as fast, just as hard. Lance took a touch longer to recover this time. Still, he did it. He forced it all back, then turned his head to face Corrales again. And he stared at her, face deliberately blank. He didn't have to say anything. She knew what he was thinking. Corrales' upper lip twisted in utter contempt. Then she leaned back and slowly rose to her feet. She stood over Lance, staring down at him the way someone stared at something particularly wet and disgusting they had found on the bottom of their shoe. "Thank you for making up my mind," she said. Lance blinked. She stepped back and crossed her arms over her chest, legs spread in a power stance, and looked between Keith and Lance. "I came in here to examine you myself, to decide whether the red paladin or the blue paladin should be tested next. I was prepared to choose either one, depending on what I learned. And yes, I have chosen." She looked to Lance with the most smug, self-satisfied expression Lance had ever seen, and he had seen Pidge's face after she solved some weird technological problem that had even had Coran stumped for decades. "The blue paladin will serve. You were curious about what we have done with the yellow paladin, yes? Now you will learn." As if her words had electrified him, Hunk chose that moment to reveal that he was no longer sleeping. He exploded up out of his position against the wall, rising like a monolith of protective rage, a volcanic explosion of yellow and brown. He didn't say a word, didn't make a sound, just threw himself at Corrales with his hands outstretched, reaching for her neck. He almost made it. His fingers were a hair's breadth away from locking around her throat. Then some unseen guard watching over the monitors activated the cuffs around his wrist, and Hunk's hands immediately began to sink to the floor. He tried to fight it, tried to keep his hands in the air, still reaching. But even his strength had a limit. Whatever the cuffs were made of, however they worked, they were too much for Hunk. They pulled his hands down as if they suddenly weighed hundreds of pounds, and he crashed to the floor at Corrales' feet with a cry of pain. For long moments, Corrales stood there, staring down at him. Her chest heaved with several large, deep breaths. Lance himself barely breathed, watching her eyes. They seemed just the slightest bit larger than they had been before Hunk threw himself at her. Had he surprised her? Frightened her, even if only for a split second? He hoped so. It was the only victory, however small and meaningless, that they were likely to get out of this. Lance's own heart was beating rabbit fast, but his throat was choked and he could not speak. He wished with all his heart that Hunk had remained asleep, that he hadn't tried to intervene. What would she do to him now? He was at her mercy, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing that Lance or Keith could do to stop her. Hunk, for his part, glared up at Corrales entirely without fear. Defiance screamed in every line of his body, even hunched over with his wrists now bound to the floor. His mouth was drawn in a wide grimace of anger and distaste. "I don't care what you do to me," he said, his voice harsh and grinding. Again, Lance heard that rasp deep in his throat that meant he had been yelling, maybe screaming, and he winced in sympathy. "Take me again, beat me again, violate my mind, try to pry all the secrets you want from me, but leave Lance alone." Lance couldn't let that be. He opened his mouth to protest, but Corrales' laughter cut him off. He stared at her, heaving for breath. She laughed, throwing her head back, arms still crossed over her breast. It was loud and mocking and derisive, and the sound seemed to burn against Lance's ears. How dare she? How dare she laugh at Hunk's courage, his defiance? Then she lowered her head, still grinning, and looked down at Hunk. "I was debating how to punish you for trying to attack me. Thank you for telling me how. Yes, I will take the blue paladin. I will keep him for a long time, and I will bring him back broken. I think that will be a grand punishment for you." "Hunk,
roared. He fought against the cuffs like a maniac, far harder than Lance or even Keith had done, because of course this was his first experience with them. He didn't know how useless it was. He pulled so hard, so mightily, that Lance feared he might actually dislocate his shoulders, tear his elbows, break his wrists. "Hunk, stop!" he cried, finally finding his voice. "Stop! Stop! You'll hurt yourself!" Hunk's back heaved. He got his knees under him and pulled, his entire body straining with effort to absolutely no effect. He was all but frothing at the mouth now with rage, and it was terrifying to witness. "Hunk!" Lance cried, tears in his eyes, in his voice. His voice was high with terror. He had never seen Hunk like this, so hysterical and enraged and out of control. He never wanted to see him this way again. "Please, babe, please stop!" Finally, Hunk heard him. He fell still, heaving and panting, and looked over his shoulder at Lance. His visible eye was wide, almost rolling, and Lance caught his breath in sympathy and pain. "Hunk!" he called again, from across the echoing canyon of 3 feet that separated them. Heard the sob in his voice. "Stop fighting, please. Please, I beg you. It's okay. I'll be okay. I swear I will. Just be okay. That's all I need from you. Just be okay." Hunk went limp. He fell to the floor, panting. He was sobbing, too. 2 guards came into the cell, bypassing Hunk and stepping over his prone body without a word. Another buzz, and Lance's cuffs released and dropped his hands to the floor. The guards seized him by the arms, hauled him to his feet, and dragged him away. Lance didn't fight them. He was glad. They were taking him instead of Hunk or Keith. So it was fine. It was what he wanted anyway.